Welcome everybody to day 2 of the ARIS Summit. We're glad to have you all here. And yesterday was a great day. Hopefully you were able to hear the keynote and hear some of the other sessions, and we're looking forward to another great day today. I'm Jory Weintraub. I'm with ARIS, and I'll be hosting this session, which mostly means I will be muted and in the background. But if you have technical issues or questions, go ahead and put them in chat, and I can try to respond to them as well as possible. So today's session is called Assessing How Americans Want to Engage with Science, Research to Inform Public Engagement. And our two speakers are Eve Klein, who's a senior advisor with the Association of Science and Technology Centers, or ASTEC, and Chris Volpe, who's the executive director of ScienceCounts. And I'm just going to hand it off to them. We are recording today's session. Eve and Chris, you're welcome to take it away, and you might want to just clarify right up front how you'd like people to handle the Q&A. And with that, I'll mute and let you take it away. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Jory. And hi, everyone. It's really a delight to see a lot of familiar names here, and some of you I haven't had the chance to meet yet. As Jory said, my name is Eve Klein. I'm a senior advisor with the Association of Science and Technology Centers. Among other things, I wear several hats like most of us. And I'm joined by my colleague, Chris Volpe, who will introduce himself in a moment. He's executive director at ScienceCounts. And this morning, we're going to share with you some of the key findings from a year-long study that investigates Americans' motivations for and barriers to engagement with science. And this study has been a collaboration between ASTC and ScienceCounts. And we've been supported by a number of other partners and philanthropic organizations that you'll see listed momentarily. I want to share a few notes before we dive in. So first, this was a really sizable study. So what you're going to hear today really is just a few of the key findings. There's a lot more to come from all of this, and we'll point out some specific places where we know there's more to dive into. We have more to explore in the actual data that we have on hand. There are also, as with all good studies, we would say that this raises more questions than it answers. So we know that there's a lot of future work to be done as well. So as we go, again, we'll call out some of the areas where we know there's more to explore. We'd also love to hear from you what questions you have, where else you think there's more exploration to be done. So on that note, please, as we go, do share your questions in the chat. We're going to go through sharing some of these key findings, and then at the end, we'll get through as many of the questions that are in the chat as we can. I want to share one more important note, which is that this is actually a preview. So our public launch of these findings is this Thursday. And you can find information about the public webinar on ASTC's website if you'd like to join us then. But it means that we ask you please to not share any of these slides. I know some of you may want to jot down information or even take screen grabs, and that's fine, but please don't share any of this since we have not yet gone public with any of this. So I'll pause for a moment now, and Chris, invite you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Eve. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Volpe, Executive Director of ScienceCounts. We are a small and ambitious nonprofit that's working to lift awareness and support for science. And we've been doing various forms of research for the last 7 years. A lot of it is assessing sort of general baseline attitudinal data about how Americans think and, more importantly, feel about science and technology and related issues. And we're really excited to be part of this study because for us, it bridges sort of the research world and the practitioner world. As Eve is going to get into, a main motivation of this work is to actually gain operational data that we can put into practice. And as Eve has said, there's a lot there, and we're going to touch on almost none of it for this brief. We want to sort of, this is a strategic level conversation, but we're going to be making that operational data, the nuts and bolts and the tips and the hows and how nots, available to this community as soon as we can in the weeks ahead. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, Eve.
So Chris, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and start sharing the slides. And we'll kind of walk you through what to expect from the next hour that we have together.
And Eve, just there we go.
All right, yeah, there we go, perfect. So as I said, there have been a number of other partners involved with this project. You see them listed here, and of course we want to thank all the foundations that have supported the work. So Chris, you can go ahead to the next slide.
Sorry, I'm having mild technical issues.
No worries, no worries. So as we go through today, we're going to share this sort of in 4 chapters. First, I'll quickly go through some introductory concepts and the methodology that we used. Chris will then talk us through science interests, which led us then to explore science engagements. And finally, we'll discuss barriers to engagement. And you'll see how each of these 3 components really inform one another. One of the big areas of focus for us was understanding how these are interconnected. Next slide. Chris already touched on this a little bit, but I'll just share our overall project goals. This was designed with practitioners in mind. Our intention was to gain insights and data that will help practitioners develop more effective public engagement activities. And we hope that as you hear us talk through our findings, you will find direct implications for the work that you do. There were a couple of novel features about this study. The first is that, as far as we know, we are the first comprehensive national study to assess Americans' willingness to participate in these science-related activities. We wanted to really understand what will predict somebody's willingness to engage in various engagement activities. And to do that, we did a deep dive into the motivations that seem to correlate with engagement willingness. And finally, we wanted to better understand the barriers to engagement. And this project has as a particular focus looking at African American and Hispanic communities to try to better understand their motivations and also the barriers that they encounter on their way to engaging with science. To ensure that we have a better understanding of the range of experiences felt within these communities, we oversampled. That is to say, we had our general draw was matched the census data, but we then included larger numbers of African American and Hispanic participants so that we can have higher resolution data and again, understand some of the nuance in the experiences of those communities. All right, next slide. And then finally, I'll just share briefly our research methodology. This study was a large survey bookended by 2 rounds of focus groups. The first round of focus groups really informed the development of the survey and helped us understand what some of the complexities of the experiences look like. The survey was lengthy, as you'll see here. It was about 50 questions, thus all the data that we have to sift through. There were over 2,500 participants, and it was out in the field in December of this past year. And then a final round of focus groups enabled us to gain a more nuanced understanding of some of the results that we saw from the survey. All right, and with that, I'll turn it back to you, Chris, to talk through science interests.
Thank you, Eve. So where we started was we wanted to talk to the public. And again, Eve said, this is focused domestically on the US only. We want to talk about things that people like to spend time on and what are their core motivations. So we asked people to share the organizations they belong to, the hobbies that they, that participate in, causes that are important to them, and then, of course, their science interests. And a bit of good news, I guess, is that 94% of all participants selected at least one science interest. So there's not a huge number of anti-science folks out there, as we sometimes hear, from various sources. The next step was not so much to inventory all of these different likes and interests, but get down to the core motivations. Why do people choose to spend their time engaging in these various activities, and what's driving, in particular, their science interests? So the way we did this was we had them go through a battery of 20 different motivational statements and ask them to rate on a scale of 1 to 5. This is absolutely perfectly explains my motivation for doing whatever, versus, no, this has nothing to do with why I do whatever. So I want to share what were the top 5 motivations that drive people's science interests. Okay, so for 36% of the sample, To spark my imagination and sense of wonder was number one, closely followed by to gain new knowledge or skills, then brings me joy, makes me feel good, followed by I can pursue on my own, and then at 29% physically, mentally, or emotionally recharge. And again, there's another 15 motivations that are below this, but these are the top 5. Now, these are the statements that people saw as they were evaluating whether they're relevant or not. But to make life easier for us as researchers and for this presentation, we want to assign tags or labels to these statements, which we think are pretty accurate, and they capture what the sentiment of those statements are. So, the first one we really kind of define as being related to curiosity. And we know that some of us on this call study curiosity very much, and there's lots of facets to it. We're not trying to get points for accuracy, but we think that that's a pretty good representation of curiosity. Mastery is interesting in that it's sort of the flip side of curiosity as we use it here. And in fact, in our survey, those two things track very closely together most of the time. Okay, so our finding here is that curiosity, not a big surprise, is the principal motivator that drives interest in science. Next, we thought it'd be interesting to compare these top 5 motivations for science interests to the other 3 areas, and what are the top 5 motivations for them. So here you can see the top 5 motivations for hobbies, causes, and organizations. A couple interesting things to note right off the bat. First of all, that the strength or prevalence of the motivations for science interests is lower than it is for the other 3 things. That's probably not a big surprise for most of us. That's why a lot of us do what we do, is we're trying to change that. The other thing that's interesting is that the curiosity motivation and its companion, the mastery motivation, don't appear in the top 5 of the other 3 things. But there are some similarities. And if you look at the number 3, 4, and 5 position for science, you see actually that at least joy appears in all of the top 5. Again, not a big surprise. We tend to like to choose things that bring us joy. But what is particularly interesting is that when you compare the science interest to the hobby motivations, that the number 3, 4, 5 motivations match up with number 1, 2, 3 for hobbies. And in fact, that actually continues. If you look deeper into the motivational ranking, in essence, the science interests resemble the hobby motivation profile. The only difference being that curiosity is lower for hobbies, and that hobbies overall, people have a stronger motivation for. So something to think about. In terms of, really doubling down and exploring the role of curiosity in science interests, one of the things that's interesting to see, first of all, is that those motivations we saw are remarkably consistent across all demographic groups. So the top 5 for group A are still the top 5 for group B, C, D. And that was a bit of a surprise. Some interesting news as well is that the prevalence of curiosity is actually virtually constant. It's universal across all these different demographic groups: race, age, household income, education. There's a little bit of variation. Please keep in mind that with the numbers we're sharing, the percentages, the 95% confidence interval is about plus or minus 2.5% or so. So any difference that's not at least 4 or 5% isn't necessarily a difference. So, there is no curiosity deficit at a high level among any particular group when it comes to science interest. And that's kind of interesting. We also see the very strong correlation between one's curiosity motivation and the number of science topics that people are interested in. And you can just sort of qualitatively let your eyes track here and see that these two track pretty well. Again, just reinforcing the fact that curiosity seems to be the principal factor in driving science interests. Now let's go beyond interest and talk about engagement. Of course, we went into this thinking, okay, well, curiosity, it's got to have an important role. Let's see how. So what we did was we had in our survey a menu of 31 different science engagement activities. And we didn't ask people which of them they actually do. Because we went into this study kind of knowing the science engagement is pretty low. But what we did was we asked them, which would you consider doing? So it's a bit of a forecast, what's your willingness to try any of these out? Well, good news, 94% of the respondents selected at least one activity. So again, there's stuff to work with here. In terms of the list, and I'm sure many of us are curious what that list was, it was informed by the focus groups, but it had a wide range. It had everything from watching YouTube videos to going to science museums to participating in clinical trials to doing citizen science and kind of everything in between, because we really wanted to be pretty comprehensive in the sampling of what we were asking people to consider. In a related note, we asked people how they felt about the time that they are able to spend pursuing their science interests and engaging with science. And encouragingly, the majority across the board wish they had more time to pursue their science interests and science activities. So certainly there's demand here for what many of us are offering people. So that's sort of a good baseline marketing metric. In fact, it's about 60%. Interestingly, the demand in wanting to spend more time to pursue science activities actually, again, tracks really well with the number of items that people chose off our engagement list. So overall, the population chose just under 4.6 activities off our list. And you can just see sort of the highs and lows follow. Now we're going to use the number of engagement activities that people chose as a proxy for interest. So this slide is sort of showing it's a basis for the justification for doing that. There's pretty strong reason to do that. So we wanted to look at possible connections, like what is an explanation for whether someone chooses a lot of engagement activities versus a few. And we ran a regression analysis on the 20 different motivations that we had asked earlier in the study. So basically, we're looking for correlation between the individual motivations and how many engagement activities people selected off our list. Well, and again, as Eve had said, we went into the study sort of with this extra emphasis of wanting to dig a little bit more deeply within the African American and Hispanic community. So that's why we kind of break it out from the get-go like this. And we found actually among white adults, there was a very strong correlation between level of curiosity and the number of engagement activities they selected. There was also a little bit of a correlation with another motivation, which we label growth, which is the desire to improve myself, prevention, which is my desire to prevent harm, or I do something to prevent something bad from happening. Networking, which the statement was to meet new people. So there's a social element to this. And then mastery, which again, not a surprise given that curiosity is there. And the size of these boxes is quantitative. So it gives you sort of a rough feel of the magnitude of influence that these motivations have on the engagement activities. Okay, not a big surprise for us, frankly, going into this, but now this is where we were frankly shocked. When you look at the African American cohort in the survey, there was only one motivation that seemed to correlate with the number of activities, and that was grounding. And grounding is the phrase, it centers me, it reminds me of what's important. But that was it. And that's not enough, frankly, to explain, the patterns we see with engagement. And then among Hispanic adults, this is it. None of the 20 motivations track at all via the regression with the number of engagement activities people selected. So what does this mean? And certainly you can see curiosity doesn't appear for African Americans and Hispanics. So this is a very delicate point. So I'm going to try to make it. And when I say delicate, I mean, it's important that no one walk away with the wrong impression. We know that white African American and Hispanic adults have equal levels of curiosity, and that drives equal interest in science interest. That's where we were just a few minutes ago. What this is saying is whatever an individual in either one of these communities is thinking about when they're choosing activities, curiosity, if present, is being masked by other things that they're taking into account. In other words, this is not to say that curiosity doesn't matter when driving activity, selection for African Americans and Hispanics. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But what it suggests is there's other things that matter as much, and that's masking. So imagine other sets of hands on the steering wheel as you're trying to drive. And so it's creating a more complicated situation. So that set us off in a direction to figure out what is this other thing, other than these 20 motivations, other than curiosity. What else could it be? And we actually found that there are two other things that matter as much, if not more, than curiosity. The first is connection. We had a little question in the survey which simply asked, when you reflect on your science interests, do you see connections between those and the other things that are important to you in your life? And what you see is for white adults, about a quarter saw lots of connections, 39% saw some connections, 36% or 35% saw no connections. But for African Americans and Hispanics, they saw more connections overall. In fact, only a quarter didn't see any connections. And that was kind of a clue that maybe that's a partial explanation for what's driving the selection. And in fact, to just save time, what I'm going to do is show the relationship between curiosity, connections, and the number of engagement activities selected. So let me walk everybody through this. If you look at the key on the upper right, it sort of makes sense. The bottom box, the 2.7, okay, that's the fraction of white adults, white Americans that have low curiosity and say they see no connections between their science interests and their other interests. And on average, they chose 2.7 activities off our menu, okay? Above that, you can see the opposite. The 7.1, that's high curiosity and see connections. That group chose 7.1 activities. And the box on the left is the high curiosity and no connection cohort. The box on the right is the opposite. It's the low curiosity and connection cohort. And so you can see the dependence here, and clearly both of these matter. And I should say that the connections people and the curiosity people are not the same people. It's not two different measures of the same group. There's a little bit of overlap, but they are independent. They are independent measures. Here among white adults, curiosity matters a lot more than connections, but connections does matter. That story changes when we look at African Americans. For African Americans, what you see is that curiosity does matter. It's having some effect on the number of engagement activities people pick, but that's of the order. It's actually a little bit less than the role of seeing connections between my science interests and the other things that matter. And for Hispanic adults, it's kind of an in-between story. But again, the role of connections, sort of that plus 1.2, is greater than it is for white adults. So what's the take home here? The take home is that we found in this study at a strategic level, there are two big factors that positively drive willingness to engage in science activities. One is curiosity, the other is connection. And the relative importance of those two actually varies in a very significant way by race and ethnicity. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. And to some of you who are out there doing this every day, this may not seem, this may be no new news. This might be exactly what you've learned through experience. But it's saying that, curiosity is important for engagement, but it's not enough in many cases, especially among marginalized communities. So Eve, I'm going to turn it back to Eve because we're going to talk about the other thing that matters as well that we found. But unfortunately, it matters in a negative way, and that's barriers.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So as Chris said, we really wanted to understand the ways that barriers are impacting the willingness or the interest or the excitement of various communities to participate in science. Next slide. So to do this, we presented our survey takers with a battery of 24 barrier statements. And we, for the purposes of analysis, have divided these into 4 different buckets, although I want to be clear that when the survey takers saw these, they were not divided up into categories. These are categories that we've applied retroactively. And they're not perfect categories, but they're useful. They've been helpful in making sense of what we see. So the categories are logistical barriers, which include things like, I don't have time. It's hard for me to find transportation to places where I can take part in these opportunities. Value proposition. If you can click forward, Chris. Value proposition barriers, which include things like, I find them boring, or things that I'm interested in are not usually covered. Next. Belonging barriers, which are things like, I feel uncomfortable asking questions about topics I don't know much about, or I've been treated with disrespect in these situations, so I avoid them. And finally, identity barriers, which include things like science activities don't reflect contributions of people with backgrounds like mine, or the exhibits and activities are usually about the accomplishments of white men. And these were largely drawn from conversations we had in the first round of focus groups. These are the types of barriers that we heard our participants describing. So go ahead to the next slide. So across the board, we saw in the data that our Hispanic and African American participants were more likely to experience barriers of all 4 of these types. So across all 4 categories, we saw that a higher percentage of Hispanic and African American participants had experienced at least one of these barrier types, or at least one barrier from each of these types. So a couple things to consider here. First, from the numbers, it's clear that people were selecting more than one barrier. People clearly were selecting multiple barriers across categories. But if you think about that even further, and so that of course means that they may be experiencing compounding and overlapping barriers, and it complicates the picture. But if you think about that further, it almost doesn't matter, because one barrier, depending on what the barrier is, can be plenty to keep a person from participating in some kind of an engagement activity. So we know it was important to dig in a little bit deeper and to better understand which specific barriers in these categories are having what impact. Next slide. So a few different things to see here. So some of the barriers are really having similar impact across the communities that we explored. So some like barriers of cost, or a sort of identity barrier, I'm not much of a science person, that has pretty statistically similar impact on these different communities. There are others in the lower left here that you'll see are impacting both the Hispanic and African American communities more so than they are the white communities. Science activities don't reflect the contributions of people with backgrounds like mine, or in the past I felt embarrassed or put on the spot in some of these activities. Those have a substantially greater impact on Hispanic and African American communities. But we wanted to look even more, we wanted to get more granular and actually understand the differences between the experiences that these communities are having. And so in the lower right, we see here that there are specific barriers that really stood out as having a disproportionate impact on one specific community. So science exhibits and activities are usually about the accomplishments of white men. Our African American respondents really felt that barrier to a greater degree than did either of the other groups. Not enough exhibits or activities are in the language I speak or that my family speaks. Our Hispanic respondents felt that more so as well. And so the sort of call here is to make sure that we are paying appropriate attention to the individual experiences and the differences between the barriers these individual communities are experiencing, rather than lumping together any groups. Now, a couple things I want to say here. First, we've said a few times that we do have extra data, extra participants to learn from our Hispanic and African American groups. So a next step for us as a project team is to explore in even more depth and understand some of the individual experiences, the way that these barriers actually feel as a lived experience, what they look like, how we hear people describing them in more detail to understand more of the nuance, and to better inform what we can do as practitioners. That's a next step for us. But there's a few things that we can see and learn from what we already have in front of us. The first, I'm going to frame as good news, which is that we don't have to guess here what the problem is. this is clear. People are telling us explicitly, these are the reasons that we are not participating in public engagement activities. And so the onus now is on us as a community of practitioners to figure out how to tackle and dismantle some of the barriers that we know are in place. I'm not saying that that's easy, but that is our task. My second call to action here is that we really clearly need to be doubling down on the diversity, equity, access, and inclusion work that we're doing. Because if you look carefully at the bottom row, all 4 of those that are disproportionately impacting specific communities, those are barriers of belonging and identity. And so the work that we are doing around equity and inclusion, this isn't extra work. This is the core. This is the work that we need to be doing to actually increase and strengthen public engagement with science. And finally, I'm going to share one more finding that might seem counterintuitive at first blush, but if you think about it a little bit more deeply, it's going to make more sense. So throughout this study, and Chris has now spoken about this in a few different ways, we see that there are folks who indicate that curiosity is really their primary motivation for their science interest. We see that there are folks who report seeing a great deal of connection between their personal interests and science. And we see that both of those groups are the ones who are most likely to select more public engagement activities from our list and to indicate that they would like to be able to spend more time on engagement with their science interests. So these are the folks who are ready to go. They are eager to be involved. They are the ones who really have the appetite to do this work. And they are the ones who report seeing the most barriers. And again, at first blush, that might feel counterintuitive because you'd think more barriers would lead someone to disconnect, to not want to participate. But the reality is it's the reverse. And I'm going to use a metaphor that Chris threw out in passing a few weeks ago that I found to be really useful. He said, you don't notice the moat if you're not trying to get to the castle. And I really liked that because I think that does explain what we're seeing here. It's the folks who want to be involved, who are interested, who are paying attention, who are the ones who are most aware of the barriers that are standing in their way. So again, I'll frame this as encouragement because it means that if we really can double down and tackle and work on dismantling some of the barriers that are in place, there is an audience that is eager to take on some of these activities. So I take that to be encouragement. We're going to shift to Q&A in just a moment, but I think we're going to move to some key takeaways. Is that right, Chris? Do we have that slide?
We do, Eve, but I think you did a really nice job summing it up already. So we can dispense with this or just go through it very quickly.
Yeah, Chris, why don't you talk people through it really quickly and then we'll turn to Q&A. While you're doing that, I'll start browsing some of the questions that have come through.
Absolutely. So, to sum up at a high level, what we found is curiosity does matter. And how much it matters depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about science interest, it matters a lot. In fact, it looks like it matters more than anything else. The good news is that the level of curiosity across American society actually is remarkably universally the same. There isn't a big curiosity deficit that we detected in any particular group. So that's not necessarily a place. And again, I want to focus, we talked about adults here. This is an adult survey. I'm not talking about, under 18. That's a different world. The other thing is, as we said, what looks like is driving motivation to actually turn a casual science interest into a more substantial science engagement is 2 things: curiosity and recognizing a connection. You could use the word relevance if you wanted. I think that's a fair synonym for the word connection as we're using it here. And the relative importance of those 2 motivations does differ. And it differs systematically, according to what we found, by race and ethnicity. We looked at other demographic crosses, and it doesn't matter. We were a bit surprised that education didn't matter more, education level didn't matter more, or household income didn't matter more. It mattered a little bit, but it's really this very different experience that seems to be revealing itself, and different things matter when it comes to race and ethnicity. And then, as Eve summed up, those are sort of the gas pedal motivations, but there's a brake, and the brake is the set of barriers. Some of them are logistic and they're shared by everyone. Others, though, are very closely related to the identity of particular parts of American society. And again, as we said earlier, we have a lot of fine data, like operational, tactical level data that we're eager to get in the hands of folks like you, so that you actually have specifics to see as you build, monitor, and assess programs. And we all work together to try to have a greater and more effective impact. So Eve?
All right, fabulous. So we've got a lot of really good questions coming through, and I'm going to tackle a couple of them, and then Chris, I'm going to volley a couple of them in your direction. First, I want to acknowledge somebody said, I saw Michelle Race's name at the beginning of the presentation, and we were remiss not to acknowledge that her name was on that opening slide. She is our third musketeer. She is the third member of this project team. She had a conflict this morning, but she's a fellow with ScienceCounts. She's a member of this year's Civic Science Fellows cohort, and she's been working closely with Chris. And Chris, do you want to say a little more about what she's ultimately going to do with some of this data?
Yes, so Michelle is a Civic Science Fellow, which is part of an initiative that is led by a handful of philanthropies, led by the Rita Allen Foundation. And she's been helping us mine this data because she's looking to actually develop a pilot program based on this data and try a novel engagement activity that's focusing particularly on the African American community in Los Angeles. So we're excited because hopefully a year from now, that would have been developed, tried, and evaluated. And we're going to try to test some of the things that we found here in the real world.
Perfect. Okay, Chris, just to prepare you, I'm going to answer one more question, but then I'm going to ask you to speak to how we defined connection and how closely we think it aligns with personal relevance. But first, I want to address something that both Jeff and Kiki have asked about, which is to the very last point Jeff wrote, doesn't this just reinforce preaching to the choir? The point being, I think, is this a matter of only catering to those who are already engaged? So there's a really important distinction to draw here. When I talk about folks who are highly willing to engage, that is not the same as saying that these are folks who are engaged. Rather, these are folks who seem to have the drivers or the pieces in place that we can see correlate to a likelihood to engage. Does not mean that they are actively engaged. In fact, it probably, in many cases, it means that the barriers are indeed standing in their way. However, they are highly driven by curiosity, and they see connections between their personal interests in science. So there is a likelihood that they would engage if, again, some of these barriers can be removed. So that's distinct from removing barriers for those who are already involved. There's one more point that I want to make about that, which is that in the focus groups, in our final round of focus groups, one of the 4 groups we spoke with was specifically African-American adults who are highly science engaged already, who reported to us that they feel very much part of sort of the science community. And what we heard from them is that they were not able to participate because they felt like the barriers were not an issue for them. They literally used the phrase, I feel like I have to work twice as hard to be here, or, sort of an I'll be damned if anyone keeps me out kind of feeling. That does not let us off the hook from dismantling these barriers. Nobody should have to work twice as hard to be in a space that they have every right to be in. So I don't think this is a matter of just preaching to the choir. I think these are still really, really important steps for us to take. So Chris, can you speak a little bit more about how we thought of personal connections?
Sure. So we had a question in there, and honestly, it was an afterthought. It almost didn't make it into the survey, where we thought it would just be interesting to ask people, do you see, and I'm almost quoting, do you see connections between your science interests and your other interests and hobbies, causes, and organizations? And that was it. And that you see the data. So we use the word connection as you see it. How the respondents interpreted that, we can't really speak to it. So I think it's fair to say, sort of, there's circumstantial evidence to say, well, yes, it's related to relevance. And I think there's also circumstantial evidence in other parts of the survey that shows that when it comes to, there's a a somewhat elevated sense among the African American and Hispanic community, and particularly African American community. You see this with other motivations in other areas, where sort of identity and brand building my personal brand is more important. It has a higher role than the population as a whole. And so I think that relevance, it's not a simple, well, does this connect to this? But there's a bit more individuals in certain communities are sort of tuned in to building a portfolio of interests and activities that sort of all come together like puzzle pieces to make a whole. We see that in some other areas. I'm not sure we'll be able to make a definitive statement on that with this data set, because we didn't design the survey to explore this in a deep way. But I would use the word relevance, and I would say it's not just like, well, it's relevance, that's it. But I actually think there are some differences within certain communities. Some care more about how science and science engagement activities plug into the other things that make them tick. And other communities, it's not so much. It's sort of, in fact, it's almost the opposite. It's more of a distraction. I mean, it's like, oh, okay, this is escape from all the other stuff that I do. So that's my best answer I can give in terms of the data. I did want to, I was just looking at a couple of questions. There were a couple of demographic questions. If I could sort of I think I can dispense with that. We as ScienceCounts have done 7 or 8 national public opinion surveys about attitudes and beliefs about science. In those studies, I can tell you, I mean, with very few exceptions, the number one thing that matters is one's personal ideology. Liberals look at a lot of science issues differently than conservatives. And then the next thing that matters the most is education level. Okay, so it's political ideology and education are the two kind of drivers that polarize science attitudes. In this survey, when it comes to engagement, political ideology and education almost don't matter statistically, which is kind of remarkable. What does matter, where you do see Americans sort of, moving to different sort of parts of a spectrum, whatever you're asking, is race and ethnicity, and that's why we focused a lot on that, and actually age. And we didn't talk much about it. It's something that we looked at, but young Americans also sort of see barriers, much greater barriers to science engagement, and they have a unique set of challenges in terms of participating in these activities. Some of them has to do with time and money, but others have to do with, it's pretty clear that the way they define engagement and participation is different, whether you're, under 45 or older 45. Older 45 engagement often means you walk out your front door and you go where people are. Under 45, it very much relies on technology. And that difference in culture came out in some places in the survey. And I'm sorry we didn't have time to talk more about that, but that was something that was kind of interesting as well. And I know many of us are living that every day. So I think I'll stop there. Eve?
Yeah, let's see. We're getting a couple of questions about the makeup of our research team itself. And certainly I'll say that, after the survey was developed and we started to see some of these results come back in, we have continued to think hard about some of our assumptions and our understandings about how motivations and behaviors do align, or how we expect them to align. And certainly some of that is our own cultural understanding, our own worldview, our own experiences. I will say that Michelle, who of course is not here with us this morning, but she is an African-American adult herself, and she took a primary role in designing our second round of focus groups, because we acknowledged that our own lived experiences were not going to be adequate to understand the kinds of things that we were hoping to understand. So to that question, there's more, she alone cannot help us parse all of this data, but that's a first step that we've taken. Chris, is there any more you want to say about that?
No.
Okay.
Nothing comes to mind. If it does, I'll jump in.
Yeah. And I guess I'll add one more point, which is to say that we know that one of the areas that we have ahead of us is to get more granular into the oversample data that you've heard us refer to several times now. And for that analysis, we absolutely know that we are not going to be the ones to make sense of all of that, because we can't, because there are going to be things that we won't know to look for, that we won't recognize, that are there very evident in the data. And a few of those points have already been called out to us. I'm appreciative that some of you are saying this wouldn't have been a surprise, if you had someone from Hispanic background on your team, or et cetera. So I think that's a really important point, and I appreciate that you're bringing that up.
Yeah, let me add a little different point. In building this research, we were very, very sensitive to the fact that what we were looking at was sort of Americans' participation in science, and those three terms. The American, the public, is probably the easiest one to define from a demographic statistical point of view. We have census, and that people know how to do that well. But the other two terms are somewhat vague. What does participate and engage mean? To people that we're going to be talking to, and what does science mean to people that we're going to be talking to? And so we were very, very cognizant of the fact that the language we were going to use in the survey could potentially introduce bias, and we worked very hard, and that's frankly why we did a lot of the focus groups up front and sit down with folks to try to make sure that we could minimize any sort of implicit biases. But in the end, we came to the conclusion that we wanted to have a survey that allowed people to share as much as they could what those words mean. So, to allow them, because that's frankly part of the findings we wanted to get. What science means to one person might be different than the other. And we wanted to create a research instrument that actually allowed that to reach us, and we could then study and then pass it on. You find all sorts of wonderful things in this survey. This is something Eve and I, Michelle and others, among the highly curious group of Americans across the board, they also tend to be pretty spiritual, which is a bit counter to how I know some of my colleagues might think about that. And they also tend to be very interested in things that we might call parascience, UFOs, ghosts. Sort of curiosity begets curiosity. People who are curious about a lot of things, not just science. That's not that surprising when you think about it, but that kind of came out, and we weren't looking for that. So really appreciate the comments and the questions. And like I said, we really tried not to apply our unique cultural view on the research, because a main part of the research was to allow those different cultural lenses to sort of come through in the data set. So we could basically quantify them and measure them.
But that said, we do understand that our cultural, we can't really get outside of our cultural worldview. So again, even the premise that we expected motivations to correlate potentially with behaviors is something that is based on our culture. So just a thing to be aware of. There are a lot of good questions coming in. I'm trying to keep up, but I'm kind of picking and choosing here. I want to point to one that Marley asked about the difference between being interested in science and thinking that science is important. And Chris might laugh, because this is something we've talked about so much throughout the course of this study. It's something that I'm personally really, really interested in. And I'll say that in this study, a lot of our insight into this actually comes from the focus group conversations, because that's a perspective that's a little bit hard to pull through the survey. In the focus groups, we tried to present a few different opportunities for folks to think about engaging with science for reasons other than it being sort of like a hobby, something other than sort of recreation, and for them to play a role other than just being a learner, but for them to be a contributor or an advisor. So again, some of this, I think, Marley, is getting at your point about the critical roles that science can play in society, or for your example, in our personal lives. And we were sort of amazed at as I was amazed as a practitioner, where I think all the time about, like, science is critical, science is important, at how difficult it was for folks to think about themselves as anything other than just a learner. to think of themselves as anything other than just a recipient of information. And again, they sort of came back over and over again to this idea of science as as a hobby, just as sort of scratching a curiosity itch. And that was across all of the different groups that we spoke with in our final focus group round. And again, some of that very well may have been our premise, the way we framed it from the get-go. But that's one of the areas that I'm really hoping that we can dig into a little bit more, because I don't think we really were able to have conversations about science as important, but not super interesting. We know that exists, but we weren't really able to get at that.
Eve, if I could add a facet to that.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so prior to this research study, my organization, sort of our claim to fame, if you will, is, I don't know, we've conducted 6 or 7 of these public opinion polls. And one of the things that came out and is, in my mind, irrefutable, because it's been confirmed by Pew and others, is that Americans have a very utilitarian view of science. They assess the value of science or the importance of science based on what they perceive as the eventual payoff. In fact, the word that most Americans use to describe science is hope, which is an encouraging bumper sticker, but it's actually deeper than that. Hope means that I have an expectation of a future outcome. And that's one of the clues that say that Americans, ultimately say, well, science is I don't care about the process. I care about what eventually it's going to do. And that's how they decide whether it's worth it or not, or it's congruent with their values and beliefs or not, et cetera. So that body of work is pretty much there. So to the question, and I didn't see the question, but if I'm interpreting right, there's people who are interested in science. There's also people who think it's important, but not. Yes, absolutely. Those two things are not, you can have individuals. And in fact, I would probably say that the people who think science is important but don't necessarily have a recreational interest outnumber, not by a large margin, but outnumber a little bit of those who find recreation pursuing science interests. There's data on that. And that's one of the reasons for those of us who, I don't want to get into policy and budgets and things like that, but there is a sort of the pipeline mentality that the way that I create people who really value science and believe that our society should invest in it and use scientific information to make policy, that step one, first base, is get them interested in science first, and then everything goes from there. I don't subscribe to that pipeline mentality. I think most Americans are busy with what they do to make ends meet, and they'll support science and investment in science, and like they support other things, but they don't necessarily have to pursue it as a hobby. Those two things are great when they appear together, but one is not a prerequisite of the other, which I think is maybe the essence of the question. If it is, I hope, if not, well, so be it. But so it's perfectly okay for people to say science is important and I don't understand the lick of it. In fact, that's kind of probably where we are somewhat as a nation, certainly in certain parts of the country.
And actually that's we're just about at the end of our session here, but I see one more note. Someone said, I missed the intro. Are you sharing the slides? And I'll reiterate what I said at the outset, which is that this is actually a preview of a report that has not yet gone public, but will be public on Thursday morning. So for those of you who are able to see the full session, you're welcome. I hope you took notes if there was anything that was of interest to you, but we ask that you not share any of what you've seen here today until Thursday. On Thursday, the deck will be available both on ScienceCounts website, I believe, and certainly on ASTC's website. How do we get on a listserv for the report? That's a great question. Jory, will we have access to the folks who've attended this session?
I'm going to say 90% certainty we will. I don't promise that, but I'm pretty sure.
Okay, so that'll be our way then of sharing out when the report is available. Yeah, thanks for asking that.
And is the report is it appearing is it published in a journal, or is it being posted on websites, or both?
Nope. So we will, again, later this week, we'll be sharing the slide deck that you've seen today. And as I've said, there's a lot more analysis to come. So this is not going to be the end of it. This is sort of a, I don't know, a taster, if that's the right metaphor, but this is sort of some of the initial storylines that we've followed in the data, but we know that there's a lot more to come, and those will be coming in the coming weeks and months.
Great. Are there any
Yeah.
other questions for our speakers?
I just want to thank you all and encourage everyone to follow up. Chris and I will be around ARIS for the next little while. So so please reach out if more thoughts. You've asked some really important questions, things for us to continue to think about. So we hope you will hear more from you.
And thank you all for being here. Thanks for our speakers.